Welcome to The Explainer. So let's just dive right in, shall we? Today we're unpacking something incredibly fascinating and honestly deeply interconnected. We're looking at the direct pipeline between local, domestic issues and massive international crises. To do this, we're exploring a recent, highly detailed analysis from John Bolton, former U.S. ambassador to the UN and national security advisor, from his interview on the Erin Molan Show. Now, whatever your political leanings might be, Bolton's insider perspective offers a very specific lens on how decisions made at the ballot box or even at the grocery store can ripple out and literally reshape the globe.
Now, I want you to consider this for a second. Can the price of gasoline actually dictate global peace? I know, it sounds a bit absurd at first, right? Like, how does paying a few cents more or less at your local pump have literally anything to do with aircraft carriers or international treaties? But this is actually the fundamental cause and effect theme we're looking at today. We're going to see exactly how domestic anxieties can corner world leaders into making vast, sweeping geopolitical concessions.
We'll take the number $1.85. According to Bolton, this was a recent low gas price spotted during a stop in Iowa. And he uses this specific anecdote to make a much broader point about U.S. leadership, referencing Donald Trump's intense focus on the price of gasoline at the pump for everyday American consumers. Bolton argues that domestic economic obsessions, things like inflation and upcoming elections, often end up driving presidential decision-making. Basically, when leaders are panicked about affordability at home, their strategies regarding major adversaries like Iran can become dangerously skewed.
Section 1. The price at the pump, from local gas stations to international deals.
So how exactly does a $1.85 turn into a lever for international pressure? It really comes down to the intense tug-of-war happening right inside the Oval Office. On one hand, you have immense domestic pressures, inflation, election cycles, what politicians often package as affordability. But on the other hand, you have geopolitical concessions. Bolton warns that a hyper-focus on immediate short-term domestic wins might push a president to accept totally unacceptable deals on the world stage. For example, he cautions against any deal that might leave the Iranian regime in control of critical global trade routes, like the Strait of Hormuz, just to secure a quick political victory back home before November.
And this brings us to Bolton's pretty blunt assessment of the Iranian regime. He says, and I quote, "They're a bunch of authoritarian, medieval religious fanatics, and to them, making a deal just signals the point at which the next kind of negotiations begin." His core argument here is that negotiating for short-term domestic political gain is incredibly dangerous. In his view, the regime in Tehran inherently cannot be trusted to stick to deals. To them, a signed piece of paper is just a pause. It's a strategic stepping stone, not a permanent resolution.
Section 2. Middle East ripple effects, and what happens when allies doubt American resolve.
Okay, let's zoom out to the regional level for a minute, because what happens in Washington absolutely does not stay in Washington. The crucial thing to understand is exactly what gets left unchecked when U.S. policy is paralyzed by internal political considerations. Bolton details these specific, interconnected threats emanating from Iran. First, an advancing nuclear weapons program. Second, their material and financial support for international terrorism. He specifically lists Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis. And third, the massive threats to free maritime commerce, particularly via the Houthis in Yemen at the southern end of the Red Sea. These aren't isolated issues. They're part of a multi-pronged strategy that thrives when America's attention is entirely focused inward on election cycles.
Now get this, truly unprecedented data point. Over just the past couple of months, Gulf nations, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Bahrain, and Kuwait have all conducted military strikes against Iran. Bolton points out that this level of independent military action by these states is basically unheard of in the last 75 years. So why are they acting now? Well, the underlying motivation is that they doubt America's resolve and staying power. They're afraid the U.S. won't ensure victory or protect them, so they're quite literally taking matters into their own hands.
Let's map out this butterfly effect, because it perfectly illustrates our focus today, how domestic politics directly impact global security. Step 1. Domestic U.S. political floundering and incoherent policy. Step 2. Allies begin to deeply doubt U.S. commitment and long-term strategy. And Step 3. Regional states, feeling totally vulnerable, take independent, unprecedented military action. A lack of coherent domestic policy literally forces the hands of regional allies, raising the temperature in an already incredibly volatile region.
Section 3. The global adversary axis, and opportunism on the world stage.
Let's zoom out even further now, to the macro level. Bolton is super clear on this next point. He states, if America first means isolationism, China would be the biggest beneficiary internationally, no doubt about it.
He's emphasizing that nations like China are watching U.S. domestic politics with intense scrutiny. They're essentially waiting to see if internal political pressures and a desire to look inward will force the United States to abandon its global strategic posture, which would leave a massive power vacuum.
And that brings us to this critical concept, the Beijing-Moscow axis. Bolton points to this as arguably the most significant development out there right now, a continually strengthening geopolitical alliance between China and Russia. This axis isn't just some passive friendship. It's an active partnership that aggressively capitalizes on perceived Western distraction. When American politicians are arguing over domestic affordability, adversarial leaders in Beijing and Moscow are actively calculating their next territorial or strategic moves.
Think of these regions as one giant interconnected global chessboard. Bolton warns that these three specific theaters, the Middle East, the East and South China Sea, and the war in Ukraine, are deeply intrinsically tied together. U.S. action, or critically, U.S. inaction in one of these theaters directly alters how adversaries perceive things in the other two. If the U.S. signals weakness in the Middle East due to domestic election fears, you better believe China is taking notes regarding the South China Sea. You simply cannot separate them.
Section 4. The domestic political divide and the resulting national security vacuum.
Let's bring this explainer right back home to the U.S. to look at the root cause of all this geopolitical instability. And Bolton really takes aim at both major political parties here. On the left, he identifies a strong leftward shift within the Democratic Party, warning about the growing influence of far-left ideology on national security. On the right, he points to a growing wave of Republican isolationism, specifically citing figures like J.D. Vance. Bolton argues that extreme shifts on both sides of the aisle are creating a dangerous vacuum where traditional, robust national security policy is just being entirely left behind.
Now, because of this intense political dysfunction and the polarization we just talked about, Bolton argues that the upcoming election cycles, specifically looking ahead to 2028, are going to be absolutely pivotal. The 2028 election is totally critical for determining the future direction of the country's national security. It's essentially going to decide if the U.S. returns to a strong, coherent global stance, or if it just continues down this path of isolationism and internal distraction.
To wrap up our explainer today, I want to leave you with a final, really provocative question drawn straight from Bolton's analysis. With both parties shifting toward their respective extremes, one toward isolationism, the other toward the far left, who is actually left to worry about national security? It's a sobering question, right? It really leaves us to reflect on how our own domestic political landscapes, the votes we cast, and the local economies we worry so much about ultimately dictate the reality of global peace. Thanks for joining me on this explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll catch you on the next one.